Well, hello again. I'm Bill Russell, President of Lake Norman Chamber of Commerce, and we have another Focus Friday. And Jeff, what a jam-packed week of activities we've had at the Chamber. We've had 3 candidate forums, a public safety luncheon. We got a meet and greet in Davidson. It has been a very, very active time politically in Lake Norman.
And then you throw the red line discussion all of a sudden back in.
School bonds, Huntersville
School
town
bonds.
we've got it going on, but we really appreciate the support of Novant Huntersville Medical Center, who is the presenting sponsor of our Focus Friday. Mike Riley is on the line. He is the CEO of Novant here in Huntersville. Mike, what's going on with our hospital?
Hey, thanks, Phil. Novant Health is always proud to sponsor Focus Friday. It's I think it's one of the best events that we do with the Chamber. Very informative. Can't wait to hear from the Congressman today. I know there's a little bit of turmoil up in Washington, so that'll be interesting to hear about. As far as the hospital is concerned, doing relatively well. Busy as always. We continue to utilize our pediatric friendly ER. That's going very well. We've opened that. We just had our 1-year anniversary in October for that, so that was exciting. Otherwise, kind of status quo from a healthcare perspective. Always, proud to take care of the people in the community, and I will give it back to much more interesting people than me.
Mike, we did have a little bit of a spike in a new rendition of COVID. How is the census going at the hospital?
Yeah, census is pretty normal for this time of year. Toward the fall and winter, we start to ramp up a little bit after a little bit of a summer lull, and we're seeing that. Yes, we're seeing some more COVID patients, but generally speaking, they are in here with some other issue and they happen to have COVID. But I think some more of the older and immunocompromised population are getting pneumonia and some other things related to COVID. But the COVID like we saw it, 2 years ago, we're not seeing that at all.
Mike, you made an interesting point last time of talking about how at the start of COVID, how everybody was embracing the healthcare workers and appreciating the healthcare workers. But as this lagged on, sometimes we've shifted maybe blame to healthcare. Can you speak to that just briefly?
Yeah, I think because COVID has settled down so much, I think that's the healthcare workers being the face of COVID. I don't think that's an issue, but we continue. It's interesting. We saw huge spikes in violence towards healthcare workers, and unfortunately, even with COVID being gone, we continue to see that. So yeah, that continues to be an issue. I think, I think if you look at studies, the nurse is one of the most highly thought of. The nurses and teachers are some of the most highly thought of professions. But even with that, I think people come into the hospital not at their best, and they're stressed, and there's still that person, that face, whether it's the nurse or the doctor or the rad tech, whatever it is, that's there for them to it's kind of like when you have a bad day, you go home and kick the dog, and unfortunately sometimes the healthcare people are the dog.
Well, we certainly appreciate, I know I appreciate my physician and all the healthcare workers, and thank you at Novant for everything that you're doing. Jeff, we have a tremendous speaker today. I've been really looking forward to hearing the Congressman speak, and there's just a little bit going on in Washington, D.C. and across the world. I'm really looking forward to this discussion. So, Jeff, I'm going to turn it over to you to introduce our speaker.
All right, thanks, Bill. Well, Congressman Bishop, it is truly a pleasure to have you join us today. Dan's been, I guess, if we follow your career, coming from Charlotte City Council into the NC House, into the NC Senate, now into Congress, potentially will become our next Attorney General. The Attorney General is obviously a stepping stone to the governor, and governor is a stepping stone to the White House. So I'm just trying to calculate how many elections before I get a visit and stay in the Lincoln Room.
Yeah, Jeff, if that ever happens, you definitely can have the Lincoln Room, maybe for a quarter or a semester or something like that.
But Dan, you are, I'm completely biased, so this is probably not going to be a fair day. But you're probably, as I told my wife, maybe one of the most principled and uber ethical people that exists. Now, everybody's not going to agree with your political ideology and positions on things. And I apologize that I'm farther right than you are. But and kidding aside, I mean, it is a pleasure to have you here. You're in the middle of some amazing turbulent times. We're going to spend some time today talking about the Israel conflict. I want to talk about the speaker stuff and delve into that. But what I want to do, first of all, is give you the floor. If you can share some comments, kind of an update on things from your perspective, and then we'll jump into a little bit of dialogue and conversation.
Well, thanks, Jeff. I appreciate all that. There's a lot there. It sounds like I can't hold a job, really, is what the description was, if you dig underneath, which is I always like to get to the bottom line, as you know. But we were, you know, you were in the Senate, had just been in the Senate, I think, for a couple of years when I ran first time for the Senate. And of course, it spent one term in the House before that. I appreciate your guidance and encouragement then, and you've always been, frankly, a mentor to me. So I think you flipped some of that around in terms of what you had to say about me, and I appreciate it. But you know, here's one thing I guess I'd like to say. I'm obviously troubled, as I'm sure everyone on the call is, shrugging shoulders about what that Republicans in Congress appear not to be able to get their act together. And I know that's true, and I won't actually say that that's not an accurate understanding, but I think there is something pretty significant underlying it all. I think if you take take in the sweep of a decade or two, and you consider where things stand, the country faces some really significant and persistent problems that Congress has been unable to address and deal with. And you only have to look at you know, just one example. I mean, you could pick many, and I'm not here to give a political tirade, but you would say, if you just look at our debt and spending, I think almost every American recognizes something has to give. We went from $32 trillion in debt at the June debt ceiling imbroglio to $33 trillion in 90 days. You go beyond that, then that was a stunner to me because of the pace of accumulation of debt. Now, it's lumpy, as Thomas Massey says. It doesn't happen at a rateable, you know, increase. But that kind of rate, I don't care what the circumstances are, that pace of addition to our indebtedness is shocking. And then in the ensuing 18 days, we added another $500 billion, putting us on track to go another trillion in the next month and a half. You know, interestingly enough, there has been, even in the Republican, well, maybe especially in the Republican Party, there has been a failure to come to grips with that problem and a number of others. And it has produced in this Congress, with a very narrow Republican majority, as the Republican Party, frankly, has changed over time. And, you know, you could say Donald Trump is a cause. You could say Donald Trump is a symptom of the change. But there are changes that are occurring in our body politic as a result of the problems that we face and that have been have gone unsolved. And so what we've had in the Republican Party is an extended period of time in which the habit of Washington is to advance existing leadership by one notch each time someone goes away. And there are many who have begged the question whether or not we need something more fundamental. There's no challenged business in America that would, in the face of you know, existential threats, just go get the next guy down the hall and plug him in. And so we've had difficulty. You know, you could also say the other side of things is when you've got just a bare majority and lots of differing points of view and even animosities, differing alliances with lobbyists and folks that have influence over Congress, money and so forth. We've got a serious conflict. And I don't know exactly what the outcome is. Jim Jordan is the nominee of the conference. There are those who are mad about the fact that a handful, including me, in January, although I think our outcome was substantially different, have had the temerity to not go along with the majority will of the Republican conference at a point in time. But now, you know, that there are those who are saying, well, we're not going to cooperate with anything. So I think there's a lot. Emotion, unfortunately, is ruling over reason. But sometimes what it takes is just getting on that floor and going vote after vote. And I think we're in that phase. We are going to be, as I understand it, Jim Jordan just announced at a press conference this morning, going to be going to the floor at 10. And I think we're going to cast votes continually until he's either speaker or begins to lose sufficient ground that it's clear it can't be done. And you might say that doesn't make any rational sense, but I can tell you, having lived through it in January, there is so much activity behind the scenes that is happening while that forced march is ongoing, that it can and does produce results. And the results we actually produced in January for about the first 4 or 5 months produced a remarkable unity that almost is forgotten among the Republican conference. And then some things happen to break that down. We're going to have a change of leadership one way or the other. I think it'll be Jordan, but it is a tough season, and we'll get through it.
All right, you ready for my best Charlie Rose imitation?
Go for it, Charlie.
Well, let's jump back to the beginning a little bit, and then we'll get into the speaker stuff, because I think we could digress, and we probably will, into great detail, hopefully, to the extent you can share. But, you said you go on the floor at 10. Tell us what you envision. What would today look like for Dan Bishop? And then what's the last week or so been like for you?
Well, and these are atypical weeks, Jeff. They have been. So I think if people wonder what it's like to be in Congress, the general sense, and by the way, it's a little bit like the experience of being in the General Assembly, which was an adaptation for me, because you get up there, it's almost exhausting, because you kind of, your days when you're in town, you kind of come up on a Monday or a Tuesday, same deal. And then they're just meetings, continually with people. That also is similar, but there's more. It is, as a general proposition, it's a pretty intense activity. It's basically 8 in the morning until 10 at night. Pretty much every day you're in session. You've got your budget for your office that allows you to run a local staff as well as a staff in DC. Talented young people. You've got committee hearings each week that require a fair amount of preparation, a lot of digesting of information. So the briefings, start at the beginning. On fly-in day, as soon as those are over, you go out to your committees and meet with your fellow party members and prepare for the week's events there. I'm on the board of the House Freedom Caucus, so we have a meeting of that. We go to votes at 6:30, so we go to House Freedom Caucus general meeting after that, finish about 10 the first day, and the rest of the week is similar, the committee hearings. Obviously, since we've been in this season, beginning with the last election, when we emerged with a very narrow majority, it was immediately clear we were going to have some issues to solve and settle within the Republican Party. There's been, on top of that, and maybe displacing some of the work there at points in time, there's been just a tremendous amount of resolving things across the conference. And Jeff, here's another distinction I would say from the time that you and I spent in the state Senate or I spent in the state House. We spend a lot of time going to caucus meetings and trying to get the party in a particular position. Here, that conference is so large. I mean, that's one of the things, this parliamentary body at 435 members, and even in the Republican conference, 222 with this very narrow, or 221 right now. We have conference meetings day after fly-in every week, but it's hard to settle anything there. You can get a message from leadership there. And members get a chance to comment, but it's hard to have a deliberative process. So one thing that's happened this year that I think has been healthy and is still working through is we've had there's tended to be, over time, people have settled down into sort of factions within the Republican conference. I mentioned the House Freedom Caucus is one of them. But we've had more conversation and working relationships across the pieces of the conference than ever before. I think that's actually a positive sign. More rank and file, a development of leadership and ideas. Jeff, one thing that you and I talked about back again when I was first coming into the Senate is how much concentration of power there was at the sort of the top in the leadership ranks there. I know you remember talking to me about that. That's been a problem here, and I think we've actually opened up that process considerably this year. There are benefits to be paid from it, even though I think we're in a process of transition, as I said. But But anyway, that I think I was trying to give the general picture of a very hectic life here. When you're out about 1 week out of every 3, the responsibilities in your district, both political and non-political, are intensified over what I experienced in the General Assembly. So it's anybody's foolish enough to come do this, it has to reckon with the fact that it is a very time-consuming, hectic life, and a great honor to do and a privilege to experience. But this point in particular, while we're dealing with this sort of transitional politics here in Congress and the intense, deliberations that it's caused, there's been yet another added layer that has really kind of consumed all time. So it's really hard to do anything else but pay attention to the job here.
Can you walk us through, this is kind of be a long question, so there's kind of multi-parts. Take us through, where's the real decision-making get done between the overall conferences, the caucuses? I know it's different in Congress and it functions at the state legislative level. Where and how much work is really done in the committees or actually by staff behind the committees? And then can you walk us through the major caucuses, and do you belong to multiple? Because we used to do that, but I know the Freedom Caucus tends to take the problem solvers. There's certain caucuses that are also bipartisan, right? There's members from both parties, like problem solvers. The Freedom Caucus is predominantly Republican members, I believe. So maybe walk us through some of those components and structures.
I don't know if I can even name them all, Jeff. We refer to the sort of major ones and there are many caucuses. There's a sportsman's caucus I belong to. There's a border caucus. So almost every cause. There's a heat team, which is on energy. There's one on sort of pro-life issues. They call it the values action team. So a lot of those things there are multiple memberships. The sort of main ones that I think it's unfortunate, but have been referred to as the 5 families, which is sort of a reference to the mob. And I'm not even sure I can name every one of those, but they go from the problem solvers, and then they change their name. So there's the Tuesday group, but then they change their name. So I can't name them all, I don't think, but I think of sort of representatives and people. Those have been both good and bad. I think they help sort of form up ideas. I will say one of the things that has been disheartening and in part a driver of the conflict here is there has been a sort of an absence of firm leadership and play calling at the conference leadership level, especially as we emerged from last November, and frankly, in advance of last November, understanding what is going to be the play call, what's the basic plan of operation for the Republican Party in the next Congress is sort of an unanswered, was an unanswered question. When we got up to and following January, frankly, those of us who negotiated before electing Kevin McCarthy Speaker came up with the plan that was effectively the plan. But I'll have to confess that it was to the right of where the Republican conference was, because it actually had a goal of producing 12 spending bills on time in a professional manner that would have a modest cut in spending. It would roll the non-defense bureaucracy back to pre-COVID levels, where it seemed like a 40% increase in what it was. And that as an introductory step to what has to come in future Congresses, which is to deal with mandatory programs. But we're convinced that until the federal government goes on a diet, there's no way you're going to convince the American people that they have to make sacrifices in terms of what the mandatory programs are that they've come to expect. So that was and we talked about in a government that spends like $6 trillion, I guess it is, and the discretionary spending in total $1.7 trillion. We were talking about like $115 billion reduction in spending. To me, that still, as I articulate it, sounds extremely modest. But the surprise to most Americans would probably, especially most Republican voters, would have to be that about 2/3 of the Republican conference, for whatever the rhetoric is, does not want to reduce spending. And I think that's, and I think the voters are, frankly, actually think polls suggest that most Americans across the political spectrum want to reduce spending. That may be invalid or false somehow, but certainly Republican voters, I think, certainly 2/3 of them at least want to reduce spending. So there's this mismatch. And what we've done for 10 or 20 years is Republican members in Congress as a lump have tried to, and the basic objective of leadership has been to kind of protect our people most on the left, or protect certain folks who are appropriators or defense spenders, by saying, suggesting that we're doing things that we aren't. And I think that's the worst problem of all. I think whatever the ideologies or the political spectrum things, if I had to do one thing in Congress, is I would introduce candor. I would stop the falsehoods and the fictions and the cosmetics. The messaging bills that we put on the floor and pass in the House chamber that don't have a prospect elsewhere. Now, there's nothing wrong if they are starting a negotiation with that, but there has to be an intentional process and an expectation that you're going to carry out a negotiation and prevail in certain particulars, even as you concede others. Otherwise, you're just engaged in an artificial game, even while this debt continues to just balloon, and the border problem worsens, and the displaced populations internally get more concerning. And then you have Eric Adams in New York saying they're destroying New York City. I just think we have to deal with problems more candidly. And I think we ought to, that ought to be maybe the first objective. I've probably wandered from your question a bit, but trying to explain, I guess, a little bit what we're struggling over, even as I give a sense of what it's usually like in Congress day to day.
Well, I'm going to wander on the question, so that'll be fair. Okay, so kind of some inside skinny and inside baseball. Help us, because I know you use the term discretionary spending. And that is typically in funds that individual members or groups have the ability to allocate to whatever line item, if you will. Sometimes America refers to it as pork.
Actually, discretionary spending, Jeff, is you got.
Oh, you're talking about the budget
programs, and discretionary runs all of the federal bureaucracy, including the Defense Department. That's the biggest one, obviously.
Right. So let's talk about, and that's where I want, is the kind of individual, not the discretionary that you can actually budget, because so much of the federal budget's fixed, right? It can't move. You don't have a way to change the vote. It's committed, like debt service, right? But on the pork side, do you have a sense, does it work similar to the state levels where the majority party is the only one that really has funds to allocate? Is it the more senior leadership, the more they have? How does that work in Congress?
No, it is not limited to the majority party. Actually, that was one of the things that I found somewhat offensive in Raleigh. Now, people would say, well, it's just politics. As long as we're moving in a direction, you're cutting spending, cutting taxes, and things are running well, you have to do some of that. I still hate it. I think they've done more of it in the last couple of years, because the federal government has, spewed out tons of money for COVID relief and everything. All of it turns into sort of a wash of money, and inflation's through the roof. Here, the earmarks, that's one of the things that's surprising. You heard a lot of politics over the course of the last 15, 20 years about earmarks, which is, member directed allocations. The majority of the Republican Congress, we debated this back in the fall, and the majority made very clear, overwhelmingly, vehemently, that they think that that the ban on earmarks was stupid, bad, and there are, it's not that there are unworthy projects in every case. Some of them are worthy, but the problem is that they are a tool by which everyone is committed to these omnibus appropriations bills, which almost every American, I think, agrees is a terrible way to make policy. You don't have any, you have the reason you have the 12 appropriations bills under the 1974 Budget and Impoundment Act is that it produces work at the individual committee jurisdiction level, covering a handful of agencies in each case. Like you have ag and rural development, FDA is one, commerce, justice, and science. You can see that's putting together 2 or 3 agencies. There's defense, there's the military construction and VA, energy and water development. So when you go through those and you're really intensely focusing on them, you get some debate internally. It's time consuming, but debate over actually what ought to go away and what things need to get reformed. When you do, instead, you end up having a continuing resolution, 1 or 2 or 3 of those, and then you get a handful of days before Christmas, and presto, out of the corner offices emerges a massive piece of legislation that covers everything. You get one up or down vote on government.
Right.
It's just obviously not. I mean, it's nonsense in terms of a deliberative body. Something's happening other than Republican government in that situation. It is a handful of people who are deciding things. And then the way you get people to vote for that, to the extent there are those who have any kind of a conscience, you pay them with an appropriation, an earmark, a project to their district. And so it's a tool for leadership to buy votes. And I think it ought to be avoided because of that. I think you ought to keep moving institutional reform in the direction of rank and file input, and you'll find that it's amazing how leaders emerge from the rank and file on specific topics, specific points in time. I think of Andrew Clyde, who is a lot of people made, he's from Georgia, a very Second Amendment guy, but he was one of the conservatives who was plugged into appropriations. He's been an extraordinarily effective legislator just on his own. Things that the general population are not going to necessarily be aware of, but it happens over and over, and things start happening. You start finding places where, yeah, indeed, this program could be eliminated or that could be reformed substantially, and the ideas start circulating. So I think it's hard work, but that's what my vision for when we fought it out and got a deal early this year was we'd have a modest cut in spending. It would have a particular objective as the beginning of a fiscal reform path. It would impose discipline on the Republican conference to show that we can function appropriately, produce the bills on time, work them out. And then you still have the problem of the Senate. I didn't ever fail to understand that, or that we're going to have to negotiate. But when you get to that point, if you've got the credibility of being able to function professionally and on time, you also have carry some gravitas into a negotiation, and you can win some things. It didn't work out, mostly because leadership could not keep it on track. People would say we want to do the bills, but they would not bring them to the floor. And one of the worst things you can do, the biggest taboo in a party structure is to vote against the rule. So every piece of legislation comes to the floor, because this parliamentary body has to be managed differently than the state Senate or House, comes to the floor under a specific rule that governs how many amendments will be allowed and which ones, governs how much debate there will be, and so forth. And theoretically, the rule is something you always vote for your party's position regardless. Well, once we'd gotten to the point that we were into September and had brought only one of these 12 bills to the floor, and they were trying to move the defense appropriations bill without any plan for moving any of the bills that were going to cut according to our agreement, a handful of us voted against the rule and took down the rule on the defense appropriations bill.
Just a quick.
They put it on the next day. They thought they had enough to flip, and they got a couple others that went awry on them. So we broke it. We took it down twice. What was the result of that? An idea emerged from rank and file to put 4 bills on the floor under one rule the next week. So we then passed. We actually didn't pass the one that cut, because the people that were more moderate in the conference voted against that. So, but the point is, even if we couldn't achieve the modest savings objective, we must get through the process of reestablishing the discipline of that practice. And so we began it, but only by virtue of an absolute rebellion against leadership at that point. And people out there could be listening and say, well, he sounds crazy because you're not getting anywhere. This is what I'm talking about, though. Doing the same thing in the same way in the face of the problems that we confront, to me, would be insane. And so even if we've got untidy and even we're stuck for a period of time, it's got to be worked through and solved. You can't just go back to putting an omnibus bill on the floor every December 18th and expect that we're going to ever begin until there's a cataclysm on Wall Street. And then who's going to be responsible for it? I would not have on my conscience that I never tried. And I just went through the elections game biennium and didn't try to do anything. So it's tough business. And obviously I have some question about whether we're prepared to make the steps we must get to. But I think it's something the American people and the American people who approve of Congress 15%. I don't know what all the 85% are thinking, whether they think we should just keep doing the same old thing. I don't think so.
So a question real quickly. Does the House function under the and follow oh God, I just went brain dead. Masons?
Under what?
Do you follow Masons?
Rules?
Yeah.
Oh,
No, we have there's an extensive. Yeah, no, we do not.
Okay.
That's and Masons, to the folks who are listening, is a parliamentary manual that we use in the General Assembly. And frankly, before I got in the General Assembly, I always heard of Robert's Rules of Order.
Masons was designed for the House. This was what Congress was supposed to be following.
That's interesting because I've never heard it mentioned here.
Wow.
There is a very extensive body of congressional precedents, just based on what they decided to do when they had it. It is interesting when we have not adopted, and we have a set of rules that are quite extensive that we adopt every session and then modify slightly depending on what the preferences are at the beginning of the session, and it's very robust. When we're not, the weird situation that we experienced early this year when we had not elected a speaker, consequently we had not adopted rules. We rely on general parliamentary law, and much of that, frankly, goes back to what's called Jefferson's Manual. Thomas Jefferson wrote a manual while he was serving as vice president for the functions of the Senate, and both Senate and House have drawn on that extensively. But I do not hear Masons mentioned up here, Jeff, and it hasn't been an issue, mostly because our rules are extensive, and the Rules Committee that develops the rule for each bill that goes on is quite restrictive in terms of what can happen on the floor.
You mentioned a particular piece of legislation a few minutes ago, the 1974 Budget and Impoundment Act, which governs how we got to the 12 appropriation bills and the process which creates or introduces the potential for government shutdown and default. Do you think you have a thought about, is it time to repeal that and do something more similar to what North Carolina does, which is if you don't pass a budget, we just operate under the current budget?
So that's a very good question. And it is at the tip of the spear of the debate that has gone on. The essential play plan or run of show that was developed at the beginning of this year when we agreed to Kevin McCarthy was 12 bills, negotiate tough negotiations with the possibility of a debt limit, stalemate, or an operating shutdown. Although frankly, the shutdown's already been dealt with in a lot of respects. A lot of the most essential functions of government, payment of Social Security checks, so forth, do not get interrupted by that. But it is possible that military pay can be interrupted, and there's some significant aspects to it. So the approach that was the approach, is we were going to have tough negotiations, and we were going to at least leave open the possibility of a shutdown or a debt limit impasse. And clearly, the conference is unprepared ever to enter into a negotiation with that as the result. And one of your chatters was asking about, I think about I was trying to find it again, but the possibility of a shutdown. Suffice to say, there's no taste in the Republican conference ever to negotiate on that basis at this point. That's reality. And as you say, in Raleigh, establishing a perpetuation of the existing budget as a matter of course has worked to the advantage of fiscal responsibility, because they can hold off doing a new budget and meeting specific needs and doing the projects that come along with that, maybe until there's they can get the big objectives agreed to. Now, Jim Jordan, and one reason, once Kevin McCarthy didn't make, was taken out, and I did not support doing that because it was less than clear to me which way we were going to go, and hence the result where we are. I think I was right about that. But the main point, or the best plan that I've heard, and many times the problem is we have an absence of a plan, but the best plan I've heard is Jim Jordan's. And his approach is, let's do a long-term CR with a 1% cut across the board. We'll take debt shutdown politics off the table, but we'll powerfully incentivize, particularly those who are the war hawks and believe we need to have continued increases in the military spending, to work assiduously to figure out where we can save money elsewhere and to pursue that aggressively. One problem, Jeff, is that in the state government, where you have a requirement to balance, because in practical effect, if not literally, that all works together in a way that seems to work. But our budgets, since we've never had the last year was $1.7 trillion discretionary spending, Omnibus Appropriations Act right before Christmas. We have massive spending. We have a structural deficit, almost $2 trillion. So to say, with 33 trillion and counting. So to say that we're going to perpetuate that is sort of not very tenable to me. And
unsustainable.
And so I don't see it as the same reform device. But I will say, given that we don't appear to have the political will in the Republican Party, and certainly the Democratic Party doesn't have any interest at all in undertaking any kind of a reform that way, at least based on experience. I'm not trying to be critical. I'm just saying that's the reality. Okay. And I'm criticizing Republicans too. Maybe it's fair, equal time. But I think in consequence of that, Jim's idea is the next best one to try. And so that's why I think it's the main argument for Jim Jordan as speaker. He wants the ball. He wants to make the play call. And I think that's where we head.
So let's jump into the speaker race a little bit. What has to transpire besides getting the right number of votes? The obvious for Congressman Jordan to become the next speaker.
You guys have heard about it.
One of the things, Jeff, that has been a little, that's been the mystery about where we stand.
Dan, hold on a second. Somebody is speaking and you need to be on mute, please. Okay, go ahead, Dan.
That is the biggest puzzle about where we are at this moment. In January, and by the way, for those, I had a lot of Republicans who said, "What, you guys should have resolved all this before you got on the floor in January." Believe me, there was so much intense work from about June of the previous year to try to get ready for what needed to be done, and we did. And now there was a lot of unwillingness to take up issues by the bulk of the Republican conference and some leadership and so forth until we were into the crisis, even until the last minute. So we went on the floor without having it resolved. But even as those 15 ballots were occurring in front of the country, we were negotiating constantly to try to get to a structure, both on how we distribute personnel, how we would reform rules, and also substantively what the plan would be. And we did. We came up with something. And as soon as we did, all but about 5 of us flipped to McCarthy. And then the others, over the next ensuing votes, because the pressure is pretty intense, came into line or voted present and permitted that to be resolved. The problem about where we are right now about Jordan is I don't think there's a similar negotiation going on. There's an attempt. Jordan has been attempting, and frankly, with the help of McCarthy and McHenry, have been attempting to bring together a negotiation over this that will resolve the question. But some folks are, I think it's fair to say, just mad. And then Jim Jordan has a certain appeal to the Republican voting base. And that has resulted in some very intense political attacks on the folks who are dissenting and has driven them deeper into the sort of logjam. So the reason I say I think that I'm optimistic going to the floor and just voting is going to push through this, it's not pleasant. It doesn't seem like it's maybe the most rational or admirable aspect, but at a certain point in time, you just got to go with the process and let her rip and let the people's, once their anger is exhausted, pressure from various points outside becomes pretty intense and people decide that they're not in a tenable position. We have to pick a speaker and move forward.
So then it begs a question that gets bantered around in over breakfast at local cafes across the state, I'm sure. Why is there no reaching out to 10 or 12 moderate Democrats to try to bring across the aisle for the vote?
Here's the problem with that. The Democrats are, I mean, that they are head and shoulders above the Republican conference in their unity. Now, their unity, and so there's not you can peel off 5 or 6 Republicans. You cannot peel off 5 or 6 Democrats. You can, they may do that ultimately for purposes of public view, if they're trying to protect those Republicans who, but the way it works, the discipline is so strong on that side. There will be a centralized Democrat decision about what the conditions are, and it will tacitly be that Hakeem Jeffries is running the show. And so I think that's the answer. If they, if you were, and by the way, you're certainly not going to get 5 or 6 Democrats to vote for Jim Jordan for Speaker. But let's say if it were Patrick McHenry, and Patrick is a very talented guy, but certainly, acceptable to Wall Street and acceptable to much of the Democratic conference. If McHenry were to become, and you could ask him and he'd say the same thing, I believe. If he were for him to become Speaker, he would have to cede control to Democrats and for their main program, or largely they would run, they would stop all oversight investigations effectively. They would, I don't know what all their conditions would be, but you would not see any Republican progress whatsoever. So there's not a middle ground avenue on that side.
So who is, one of the questions that you see floated all the time is we'll do what we probably shouldn't do. Okay, let's look at hypotheticals. But let's assume Jordan doesn't get selected today or for a while. We go another week. There's been discussion of giving temporary or increasing the powers to Congressman McHenry. Is that even a viable alternative in the interim?
It depends on how it is done. The Speaker, there was a proposal yesterday in our conference as we were to grant Patrick the full breadth of powers of the Speaker via a resolution interpreting our existing rules. Now, the existing rules contemplate, and it was put in after 9/11, a provision to say there will be a Speaker pro tem in the event this and is named in advance, who will take who becomes effective if the speakership is vacant. And obviously, it's a continuation of government thing. But it goes on to say that that he will oversee the election of a new speaker and has all powers necessary and appropriate to that end. That's the language, to that end. And it's really clear what to that end means. Otherwise, you can't
elect a speaker.
But to elect a speaker, and to allow someone who is not elected by a majority of the House to exercise all the powers of the Speaker.
Pretty egregious.
If you establish that precedent, it would fundamentally alter the speakership and endanger lots about the institution. It's not that, maybe you could say you want to do something fundamental, but not just because you have a temporary political problem. And so I was vehemently against that. I want to give a lot of credit to Patrick McHenry, because in that role, he said from the beginning, and he reasserted in that conversation yesterday, that is not the role of a Speaker pro tem, and he would not, he'd already given that interpretation, that it's limited to that end in his first comments to us after the motion to vacate was succeeded, and he's reaffirmed it. He said, I'm not going to change my position on that. And then I was actually at the mic at that moment, and I said, I thanked him for his integrity, his fidelity to the Constitution. And I said, and every one of us in here has a like obligation to integrity and fidelity. that is not the way to proceed. Now, if we're stuck, and I think we find out this weekend, if we're stuck in a way we cannot resolve by getting Jordan, I don't see another person who obviously can get to 217.
Is there a short list of people that you can even share that would be?
I'm afraid if I name somebody, it would cause problems for them somewhere. So I won't do that. Yes, there are a number who I think could do it. Patrick's one of them, by the way.
Anybody, the other one real quick, and I apologize, and then we'll get right back on your train of thought if you'll hang on to that. Because what's floated as well is it doesn't have to be a member of Congress. It's a very bizarre rule. So, you hear people like, well, let's bring Bonner back temporarily, or other people. Could an outside, or Newt Gingrich, who served, are those even practical consideration, or is that nonsense?
I think there are a couple of people out there that would merit consideration, but I really don't think it's viable based on the situation that obtains. I think it's going to have to be somebody here. And to that point, what I was saying is I think Patrick may be viable, but in fact, I also think this. What I was saying a moment ago, I don't think you can interpret your way into giving Patrick more power, but I think some may come to the conclusion we've got to elect a temporary speaker. I also will say, I think once you elect the temporary speaker, he will become the speaker. And so there's some folks who got to sort of deal with the brass tacks of all that. I don't know that Patrick could, if you just put it as a straight up, is this going to be the speaker, that he could get the necessary votes either. But I think we're going to, I mean, if we don't solve this weekend with Jordan, it seems to me we're likely to get a chance to see about that.
Interesting. Well, and just as a personal comment, which I'm not supposed to do, but I'm going to do anyway. Anybody that passes allowing temporary powers to the speaker, they should be immediately taken out of office, because it violates every tenet of the Constitution and how the institution would work. There's so many problems with doing that.
I won't identify who was in favor of it yesterday, but it was, really? For me, it was a galvanizing experience to see who was. And so I think that I was pleased that the conference overwhelmingly rejected pursuing that direction. And so I think we got to keep going. But I say all this with a great mindfulness that people out there are saying, what in the hell is going on in Congress? And they're not wrong. But I will say that there is one other angle that I took to it in January that seemed to resonate some, and I still think it's true, which is in many ways, the struggles you've seen in this session of Congress, reflective of struggles in the American body politic, ought to hearten you. People say it's chaos, and it does have an element of chaos, but it is much worse, I would submit, to every year have a fiscally irresponsible single up or down vote on government, and more like the Chinese Politburo than a deliberative Republican body. People walk on the floor and push the button, and the thing, it seems has an aura or image or patina of democratic action, but it's actually foreordained and decided by a handful of people. That's just lobbyists and special interests. It's just not the way it ought to work.
Yeah, as I say, if you're doing that, that's just groupthink, right?
Yeah.
Okay, let's jump in. We've only got a few minutes because I could keep you here all day, and then you won't be able to vote. Jump into Israel for a little bit of time before we get to the bottom of the hour. What's your thoughts, impressions? What's going on that the American public generally doesn't know, but you can share that doesn't breach any confidential briefings, classified briefings?
Well, I'll be candid enough to say, and this will maybe stun everybody. One other thing that I think reflects troubling dysfunction is that members of Congress are not very informed. We've had a classified briefing, but every classified briefing that I've had since being in Congress told me almost nothing beyond what was available in public. And when it did, it's always in the language of "we assess." And I don't, Jeff, it's not consistent with common sense. I spent 29 years litigating cases in which evidence, was how I delivered conclusions to juries. They tell me we assess, but they never tell you why. And I don't, and I'll be honest with you, I think our Intelligence Committee has similar frustrations.
So they're not getting the detail either, you don't believe?
I think they get more detail, a lot more detail. But I also know from talking to Mr. Turner of Ohio, who is the chairman, and looking at their, I'll say this quickly and then I'll get back.
Okay.
He encouraged me to look at the classified appendix to the National Defense Authorization Act that we pass every year. And it provides for the intelligence programs. And I went and looked at it. He was going to have a staffer there. That person didn't arrive. So I just sort of did it on my own. And a lot of it frankly didn't understand. But what I did see throughout that thing, and I can say without revealing any detail, is fencing provisions. They talk about this all the time. They have provisions and say, we've asked the intelligence community for this information and this information and this information, and they won't provide it to us. And so we're fencing off $100 million here, $10 million there, and they have fencing provisions littered throughout the document. And the thing that I went back and said, why don't you fence off $10 billion? Why don't you say, I'm not giving you anything until you tell me what you've got to tell us. And that, they sort of shrugged their shoulders. But that's the bureaucracy in the country is not under the control of the Congress. That's got to change too. And so I've gotten off track of it. But about Israel, I think we're underinformed. But look, I'm going to say something that I think is so obvious. If somebody disagrees with, actually, we do see amazing expressions of opinion that are shocking to me on a widespread basis. We had protests here in D.C. Somebody occupied the Cannon building. What I most see is a subject of expressions and demonstrations in the country is stunning to me. That it's all about it's only about the plight of Palestinians, which is grave and troubling. But I can't imagine any nation on the face of the earth in history that would not react quite severely to the attack that Israel sustained. And it is unfortunately a testament to our divisions and the difficulty of our historical moment that maintaining that posture, that being clear and uniform and united about that point is difficult. But I think there is politically, again, there's a resolution that's pending to go in support of Israel by the Congress, in which every member of Congress is a co-sponsor except for 13, all of whom happen to be on the other side of the aisle, one of whom is the immediate past chairman of the January 6th committee and of the Homeland Security Committee. And that never gets covered, but it's shocking to me. And of course, a number of the usual suspects. But I'm glad to say that there is overwhelming support for Israel. Israel has, by the way, is not in any kind of emergency circumstance due to our impasse here. There is a multi-year memorandum of understanding which Israel automatically receives. I think it's about $3 billion a year in support, and they can draw on that as they need it. We need a supplemental in time for it, and we'll get to that. But that's not. And so I think there'll be the president last night spoke and wasn't as clear as I thought he should be, but he expressed support for Israel. Israel, though, needs a fairly free hand to decide how to respond to that act of war. And
Sure.
I'm supportive of that. And I believe most of Congress is.
Couple quick things. First of all, this is a weird one. Do members of Congress have formal security clearances, or just by nature of being in the seat?
No, you're obliged by our rules to sign a commitment about not revealing
Non-disclosure.
That's right.
An NDA.
But you do not go through a formal security clearance process. You are and again, insofar as the rank and file member of Congress gives access to the information, and I will tell you that I've seen, I guess in the context of the Durham report, when that came out, there was a classified annex to that was interesting to me. It was the first time I've seen something that I thought was really novel about it. So I'm not sure that rank and file members even get that much, but no, we don't. And maybe some people might be saying that's a good thing.
Yeah. So, okay. And you mentioned the president has announced he's going to allocate 14 billion to Israel. Does that require congressional approval for an appropriation, or does he have some kind of EO authority to do that kind of stuff, or is he just announcing stuff that's a feel good because it could be stopped, even though he said? How's that work?
Well, he's asked for, he says he's sending a supplemental to Congress. He wants to have a supplemental, and I don't know that I remember. I thought the numbers were 60 billion for Ukraine and 40 billion for Israel and other things. But I'm not sure if I know the 14 billion you're making reference to. I know he just authorized another 100 million in relief, allegedly humanitarian relief to the Palestinian Authority, but frankly, the $1 billion that the administration has spent on those functions may have fed, Hamas is the government in Gaza. So right. Exactly how that gets used and diverted is problematic. He even adverted to that last night. He does have a fair amount of authority to administer existing humanitarian funds. Trump exercised discretion not to spend it. He's done the opposite to the tune of about $1 billion. I don't know what the 14 billion is that you're making reference to.
I think it was then part of the 40. That's just what I had read. So maybe it's a misprint or.
But the answer is that there's a perception that there is an additional appropriations need for Israel.
But you have to approve it. Congress has to.
We do, and none of us, I don't think, have received detail on why it's that number and what they intend to do with it.
So now recently you've seen Hezbollah starting to make movements from Lebanon into Israel. We saw that Yemen fired rockets that the aircraft carrier took out aimed at Israel. Is there a conversation and what degree of concern that this escalates into a full-scale Mideast war?
A great deal of concern. The world has not been this unstable for a long time, and prospects for world war seem to be quite disturbing. Two carrier task forces deployed in the Mediterranean. We have Putin touting his airborne, his aircraft sporting hypersonic missiles, with the implication they could take out a carrier, over the Black Sea within range. You have the Ukrainian situation. You may have differing views on that, but it has been now 18 months in plus, and the counteroffensive did not succeed. Basically, nothing has succeeded. There may be attrition of the Russian military, but not so much that they can be removed from hardened positions. So on the Israel face of things, you've got Iran and the prospect, whether that will remain pacified or Israel feels some need to attack Iran. Other regions, other nations. Qatar is it maintains one of our largest bases, and yet is very antagonistic and openly against the Israeli government. So Saudi Arabia in a complicated position. I'm not sure. I wish it were otherwise. I'm hopeful that cooler heads prevail and that Israel decides to defend itself with a contained action, and that its adversaries in the region decide, as President Biden has urged them, not to exploit it. But we're in a very delicate moment.
Dan, we're at the bottom of the hour. I know you need to votes coming up shortly on the floor. Any last thoughts or comments you want to share with anybody? And
I appreciate the time to talk to you guys. I appreciate great organization and great community that I've always experienced in your area there. Your Chamber of Commerce always done a great job, Bill. And Jeff, you've been, you know, when you were mayor, when you were in the General Assembly, been and since then, great leader of your community. I wish I had more opportunity to spend with y'all, but thank you for the opportunity to talk now. I've enjoyed it.
well, Congressman Bishop, you know, you're taking the time and given the things that are on your plate. We truly appreciate your time. You are really, as I said at the top of the hour, you are one of the most principled people serving. You are somebody we all look up to and follow. And that's a rarity, I think, in today's Congress. There's a lot of good people, but it's a whole nother thing to stick to your philosophies, approaches, and beliefs. And we are blessed to have you serving us without a doubt. Wish would have got into the AG race because would like to know more. So we might have to have you on top of the year. But with that, we thank you. Let you return to the business at hand for the people. And Bill, we'll give the floor back to you.
Thank you, sir. See you.
Thank you,
Dan.
Jeff. Thank you, Congressman. Jeff, you know, I tell you, we have some outstanding Focus Fridays, but that may have been the most comprehensive on current events that we've had all year. That was an exceptional Focus Friday. We got another one lined up in November. You want to tell everybody what we have coming up?
Sure. For November, we have the United States Senator Ted Budd. So hopefully we'll be further along in the Israeli matter. The speaker's situation will have been resolved, and we'll be looking forward and get some insight in what we can anticipate and good things happening on Capitol Hill for the coming year.
You think they can decide that speaker's race before November?
You know, I would have said I wouldn't have believed it had gone this long unfulfilled. But as Dan kind of alluded to, and we kind of tease about those that serve, you know, democracy is a messy business. You know, how the sausage gets made, you usually don't want to go watch. But it ends up being pretty tasty when it's all said and done. So we'll get there eventually.
It surprised me that they allowed an individual to make a motion in the first place to replace the speaker, but that's a whole another subject.
Well, the problem is that's rules that, you know, again, it's just the rules of the institution. So
Jeff, again, to let everybody know, the Chamber of Commerce, we came out in support of 2 bond packages. We came out in support of the CMS $2.5 billion bond package. Huge number, but there are some extremely important projects for North Mecklenburg, a replacement of North Mecklenburg High School, a replacement of Cornelius and Huntersville Elementary, a new junior high school, and the safety measures that have to go into new schools. So a huge number, but what we heard pretty much in Cornelius and Huntersville with most of the candidates running was they supported that bond package. There were a few last night in Huntersville that were not quite sure. They were looking for more information. Only a couple that I heard that were opposed to it.
And most of them, I think, that fundamentally it makes sense. I understand more information. There's a sense that we want to know that the schools up here that they're talking of doing will actually get done in a reasonable time frame, that they are a priority. And, you know, what's the actual spend in the sequence? Could we have done it in smaller increments? Maybe, but, you know, there's just a tremendous need. And even that's only 30 total schools throughout the entire school district.
Jeff, the other issue that the chamber has come out in support of is a bond package for Huntersville, a $50 million bond package for transportation, $8 million for Parks and Rec. Once again, in Huntersville, it sounded like everybody that's running for office was on board, with the exception of a candidate who said they were undecided on the Parks bond, I think, but
Right.
Everybody else understands the need for transportation improvements. Mayor Bells on my show on WSIC Town Talk, which airs every Wednesday 4 to 5, pretty much said that if this bond package for infrastructure does not go through, most of the transportation improvements stop in the town of Huntersville. So it's very important we get behind that bond package.
Well, it's fascinating that if you look at over the last even 2 decades, maybe for our local municipalities, have been actually pretty well run and fiscally managed. I know Huntersville and Cornelius have AAA bond ratings, which is unheard of for towns our size. So there's a lot of good prudent management fiscally going on. So the fact that these guys have identified these needs probably need to move forward.
You're fixing to take over the helm of the Chamber of Commerce. We had one of the busiest months ever for the Chamber. We started off with the Expo. We had 2 candidate forums in Huntersville, 1 candidate forum in Cornelius, public safety luncheon yesterday. The room was packed. Some wonderful recipients of police and fire who received that. We've got a meet and greet in Davidson on the 30th, Davidson Village Inn. So those who are registered voters or even businesses in Davidson, please come out 5:30, October 30th at Davidson Village Inn and meet the new officials, because they decided not to have an election. It's already over with. 5 people running for 5 spots, 1 person running for mayor. Unless there's a huge write-in campaign, those people will be elected. We've got our golf tournament coming up October 30th. Mike Riley and Novant is the presenting sponsor of our golf tournament. I think they have 2 foursomes, and Mike, you're going to take home the trophy, I suppose, for
Only if there's a last place trophy, Bill.
But we still have a few slots remaining for that, not many, but if you have a foursome or some singles or want to be a whole sponsor, I think there's some openings there. And then you have your board retreat planning the next year, so coming up. But thank you, Jeff, for putting this together today. Again, I thought this was one of the most comprehensive Focus Fridays that we've had on the current events taking place in Washington. This was good discussion.
Well, we got some very serious matters at hand.
And Mike, again, thank you very much for being the presenting sponsor, and I hope everybody has a fantastic week at the lake. We'll see you next time.